Interest payments on the national debt just exceeded the Defense Department budget, but they're over $1 trillion a year, just in interest and rising.
Banks creating money in terms of debt-created money, that itself leads to potential crises. Banks aren't intermediaries, banks originate. Banks lend to households. Physics is the law, everything else is a recommendation. Accounting is the law, everything else is actually fraud. Money is circulated between existing bank accounts. In the real world, when banks lend, they create money.
The influential contrarian economist, Steve Keen.
Brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics.
The research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College in London.
He is someone that each and every one of us has to listen to, whether we agree or disagree.
Here's Steve Keen.
Normally when I record a video, I want a lot of people to watch it. This time I'm after just one, Elon Musk. Let's see if I can get Elon's attention. And this is what he's talking about, what's going to happen with government spending if we don't reduce government spending so that it's no more than taxation.
America is also going bankrupt extremely quickly, and everyone seems to be whistling past the graveyard on this one. The Defense Department budget is a very big budget, okay? It's $1 trillion a year. Interest payments on the national debt just exceeded the Defense Department budget, but they're over $1 trillion a year, just in interest and rising. We're adding $1 trillion to our debt, which our kids and grandkids are going to have to pay somehow every 3 months. And then soon it's going to be every 2 months, and then every month. And then the only thing we'll be able to pay is interest. And it's just like a person at scale that racked up too much credit card debt. This does not have a good ending.
That's a valid fear. And I want to show how that fear plays out. If you take a look at the banking sector and model it the way that economists explain that money is created and that banks function. And Elon, I know you've done a degree in economics, so you probably had tuition that told you about the model of loanable funds. And this is for the ManQ textbook. Don't know if it was popular back when you were doing your degree, but it's very popular now, first year training. The saving, this is a supply of loanable funds. Households lends their savings to investors, bank which loans the funds out. And this is the way it's drawn as a diagram, a supply and demand diagram. Now, of course, you can't use supply and demand drawings to show how banks actually function. What you need to do, and I'm sure you're familiar with this area as well, is double entry bookkeeping, because that's what banks fundamentally do. And you need to see this model in double entry bookkeeping to know what the consequences are going to be. So I happen to have designed a software package that enables that to happen. And I'm going to build that model up very quickly here and show you in a simulation of a complete model to show what actually happens, which if the textbooks are correct, so if loanable funds accurately describes what banks do, you're right, there will be a future bankruptcy crisis. So I'm going to show banks. Of course, banks have reserves. And then we're looking at banks being intermediaries, which means that households and firms and the government all have accounts at the banks, and the banks then facilitate loans from one to the other. So we'll start with households here, and I'm going to add another column for firms and another one for the government. And then the position of the banks is their equity position is the gap between their assets and their liabilities. So I'll whack this in here as well. And let's just start with, say, reserves being $1 million. That could be 1,000 billion. It's just for illustration here. So 700,000 of that is held households, 100,000 by firms, government zero, just to start with the government with a clean slate, which is the sort of thing you want to have there. The rest of the money is in banks and firms. I'm missing a zero there. This is what my program makes sure that every line sums to zero in the classic sense that it's required by the laws of accounting. And I know you've said this about physics is the law, everything else is a recommendation. When it comes to banking and the functioning of the financial sector, accounting is the law, everything else is actually fraud. So let's just apply that law and see what we get. So we're starting for this initial level of money, and then I'm going to have the simple operations that you need to show a very bare bones model of the economy where monetary transactions occur. So firms hire workers, which means they have to pay wages, and that's going to be a payment of wages going out of firms' accounts and going into households' accounts. And then you have households consume, and that's going to be a flow of consumption going the opposite directions, minus consume from here and consume going into firms' accounts. Then I'm going to have the firms borrow, and that's going to be money which is coming out of households' accounts. So I'll make this minus lend, and that goes into firms' accounts. And then firms pay interest, and I'll make that, abbreviate that, so it's minus INT F for firms. And that means you get INT F going to households, so they lend to get the interest payments. And then say the households have to pay a fee to the bank, and that's what you'll find in the textbooks, of course. So there's going to be a fee, goes out of households and gives the banks some cash to play with, and banks will then spend. So that's going to be, I'll take this minus spending by B for banks, which they then spend on the firm sector. So that's looking at a totally private sector view. And now I want to add in the government side of things. They're going to have government taxation, and that's going to be, I'm going to just a simple model here, presume that only households are taxed. I know firms are, but this is just to show it. It's a conceptual model rather than trying to reproduce the actual structure of the economy. Spending by the government, and that's going to be minus spend, make that subscript G for government, and they also spend on firms. And then, of course, if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it has to sell bonds. So you have bond sales by the Treasury, and they've got to, again, being bought by households. So you have minus bond coming out of here, but also bond sales, and that then goes to the government. And of course, also the government has to pay interest on those bonds. And that's going to be minus interest in subscript G for the government paying it, and it goes to households. So that's the basic idea of building the structure here. That's only looking at one entity, and that's all being put back in this table, the main table here. And now what my program does is lets me bring up the other tables, and then whatever's an asset for one becomes a liability for other. The fundamental conservation law of accounting, that's every financial asset for one person is a financial claim on somebody else in the system. So I can say, what liabilities haven't yet been shown as assets? Click this down arrow, then one of them is households. That's what I'll look at here. So all the operations for households come across. And then because households are lending to both firms and the government, then both the firms and the government owe debt to the household sector. That's debt of firms, and that's going to be debt of the government. And then, of course, bonds increase the debt of the government. So I just need to type bonds in here. That's showing the financial transaction. So those are the operations that change the value of the assets. And everything else affects the equity of the household. So if they consume, they get the food, but they reduce their equity level. Interest payments increase their net worth. Taxation reduces the net worth. Wages increase it. So I can simply say, balance all of these for me. I'll leave it at that because I don't need to bore you with all the details here. What's actually being generated in the background is a system of differential equations, which, of course, with your engineering background, you're familiar with this technology. So this is building up a dynamic model of the financial system. And I've done a complete model here, which I'll now flip over to, as well as defining all the tables, as you can see here. I've also defined the flows down here. And this is, I presume you've used Simulink at some time in your professional career. This is an equivalent to it for financial and economic modeling. So this is same story I've shown, slightly different terms, but the same basic idea. Firms borrow, firms pay interest, firms pay wages, people consume, households pay a fee, banks spend, government taxes, government spends, government sells bonds, and government pays interest on the bonds. And then let's now just run this model, and I'll explain the logic later and see what happens. And you can see over here with the charts, I'll actually go across to a publication view of things here. And what you've got is, as you've hypothesized, a rising level of debt to GDP. The interest rate is rising as well. Government debt ratio is rising dramatically. And keep it on for long enough, and you can see debt's going exponential here. I'll go back to the main page again to show the interest. But this is ultimately, we're on the road to catastrophe. You can see the interest rate's going exponential here. Debt level doing the same. Interest payments are huge. This system is going to crash, and you can now see GDP starts to decline, and you've got falling GDP, rising interest. Of course, the government would have gone bankrupt long before this system. So that's what you fear. And you've got legitimate reason to fear it if the model of loanable funds, which is taught by all economics textbooks, is actually correct. But in fact, it's not. What actually happens is banks aren't intermediaries, banks originate. Banks lend to households, but they lend to firms, they lend to the government. So let's actually change who the assets are attributed to in this model. So bring up the banks table again and say, what's wrong about this model? It's not true that the government banks at the private banks. It does have some accounts there, but it's fundamentally banking at the central bank. So I can delete that. Then I come over to the households. Notice this is a model which created the crisis you're concerned about happening and concerned about avoiding. So I'm just going to go and not change any of the equations. All I'm changing is the structure to say that it's not really true that firms lend directly to households. Banks lend to firms, okay, not households. So we delete that column and delete lending directly to the government as well by households, and delete all the operations that are supposed to occur in the loanable funds model between households and banks, and households and government, households firms, get rid of that. So now I'm down to a much more simplified view of what goes on with households. And I'll just make a couple more changes here. The central bank is where the government banks. So let's just bring up the central bank table. Central bank having the liability reserves, which is true, but they've also got the liability of the government's account. So I'll just actually make an extra column here and bring across the government. And now all the operations that are shown on the government page, the column are now shown in the central banks. And what happens here is you now need to balance the lines. How are the bonds purchased? They're purchased using reserves. Where does the interest goes to? That increases reserves. So I put that as a plus there. Spending by the government also increases reserves. So whack that one in. And then taxation, which I can just type, reduces reserves. So I've got that structural set of changes done. I need to balance the equity here as well. So I'll just do that. So now what I've got to do is go over to the banks and show that they're the ones who actually own the debt, not households. Make a bit of extra space here for showing the debt of firms and then also the debt of government, which is the case. When bonds are first sold, they're sold to primary dealers. So it's the financial system that buys the bonds, not households. And then just get all the equity elements fixed up there. So having done that, we've now got exactly the same equations. You can see the simulation results are still saved there from the last simulation. What I've got down here very quickly is just very simple definitions of GDP. Turnover of money in the firm sector generates GDP. You can find that in Marx. You can also find that in Milton Friedman. So it's a common simplification for initial economic models. And then workers get a certain share of GDP, that gives you wages. Households then spend out of their bank balances. Banks spend out of their short-term equity. And then down here, I've got going that that's the government behavior. So the government has a rate of spending, and I've currently got that at 31% of GDP, which is what caused a crisis in the previous simulation, 1% more than taxation. That then determines what government spending is. You've got to add in interest payments on that to say how many bonds are issued when interest payments plus government spending exceeds taxation. A simple little model of the financial sector where the short side determines the volume and the long side determines the rate of change of prices. So that's what's going on there, a very simple linear model there. So actually, as you can see, no change as yet from the model that I ran a moment ago showing a crisis. But I'm simply saying that actual model is wrong. Okay, banks are not intermediaries. Banks lend and create money in the lending process, which the Bank of England and the Bundesbank both said back in 2014 and 2017 respectively. So I've just simply taken their lead as to what is the actual structure of the financial system. So having done that, let's just recalculate to go back to zero, and now let's run the model. Basic story, we've got a rising level of debt, but the difference is there's also a rising level of GDP and money creation, because loanable funds does not explain how money can be created. In the real world, when banks lend, they create money. So what's going on here is both government borrowing and borrowing by firms is not just increasing their debt, it's also increasing the money supply and therefore also increasing nominal GDP. And see what's happening here. Where's the crisis gone? What you've got, the interest rate's still rising to some extent, but you've got both the debt of firms and the debt of government stabilizing at far lower levels than I showed in the previous model. The problem you anticipate is real if the economic textbooks are right about how banks function, and they're not. When you change it, borrowing by firms increases the money supply, and of course also leads to construction. Borrowing by government increases the money supply. Government spending more than it takes back in taxation is what creates fiat money. We lived in a mixed fiat and credit world. We need them both for a well-functioning system. And if you eliminate the deficit, you eliminate fiat money and just have a credit money system. And what I'm trying to show here is that to some extent, your fear of the government going bankrupt is similar to the fear you expressed here.
When I was a little kid, I was really scared of the dark. But then I came to understand, okay, dark just means really the absence of photons in the visible wavelength, 400 to 700 nanometers. Then I thought, well, it's really silly to be afraid of a lack of photons.
And I'm suggesting you shouldn't be afraid of the government going bankrupt either in the existing monetary system, because it won't. Certainly there's waste, by all means. Go and get rid of some of the waste involved. But you want to run a deficit, because if you don't run one, you don't create fiat money, and you end up with all the distortions that leads to, which I'll happily explain in a subsequent video. But this is why you need to know the laws of accounting just as well as the laws of physics. In this particular case, the laws of assets minus liability minus equity equals zero for all financial assets and liabilities. Then you've got to get the structure right. And if you get the structure wrong, like economic textbooks do, you'll end up with doing the wrong thing and believing you're doing the right thing. And what you'll actually do, and I'll illustrate that now, this is what happens when you run a deficit. Notice the value of GDP up there comes out as it's 10 to the power of 8 is the level of GDP there. What happens if you run a balanced budget, spending equal to taxation at 30%? So there's no government deficit. You can see there's no debt there, and you still get growth because borrowing by firms is creating money. That's expanding economic activity, and so GDP still grows. But what level do you get to? You can see them up, I think it reaches about 10 to the 7. Let's let it run, and I'll bring up the publication tab instead to show that more clearly. Ends at the same point in terms of time. I think I ran there for 67 years, not 69, but still. You come up with about GDP being about 1/50th what it was when the government also created money. Lots to go into there, whether that's realistic or not. But fundamentally, if the government doesn't create money, then it's only the private banks creating money in terms of debt-created money. That itself leads to potential crises that we saw in the Great Depression and the global financial crisis, which I'll cover in another video. But this is the sort of thing you should be doing. I admire you for this particular observation you make all the time. Physics is the law. Everything else is a recommendation. You've got to get the physics right to send rockets to Mars, to know what to do with government spending. And at the moment, if you're believing economics textbooks, you're getting the accounting wrong.
If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to apply.stevekeenfree.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to apply.stevekeenfree.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.